A woman's scream broke the stillness of Willowbrook Plantation in the low country of South Carolina on the morning of August 12, 1843. For 60 years, journalists would not publish the facts of the scandal that Catherine Hargrove saw in her husband's private quarters that morning. Over 300 residents gathered in Beaufort's town square in just 3 days to watch a punishment so severe that witnesses took the experience with them to their graves. All records were sealed by the county until 1923, and when they were eventually opened by historians, they found that the truth was much more sinister than any rumors. There was more to this than treachery. The one individual who knew exactly how to turn the anger of a whole town into a weapon was responsible for the total devastation of a man's soul. I need you to accomplish something before we go on to the tale of Willowbrook Plantation and the scandal that ruined the Harrow family. Subscribe now if this article is chilling you already. We unearth the most sinister historical accounts of America, the ones that are purposefully obscured from history. Please let me know which state you are listening from in the comments section. Do you live near the scene of this nightmare? Because what follows is far worse, hit subscribe. Let me now transport you to 1843, when having a good reputation was crucial and losing it meant being extinct. Contradictions were the foundation of Bilford, South Carolina in the early 1840s. Spanish moss was suffocating and lovely, hanging from old oaks like death shrouds. Magnolia blossoms and salt marshy scents permeated the air, yet they were insufficient to cover up the underlying degradation. Here, white-columned houses vied for the most spectacular display of wealth and power, while fortunes were made from fields tended by slaves. In this civilization, the highest position was held by the Hargrove family. 7 years prior, at the age of 35 in 1843, Edmund Hargrave had acquired Willowbrook Plantation from his father, an 1838 Greek Renaissance home on 3,000 acres of magnificent land, French crystal chandeliers and heartwood floors that were so flawlessly connected that the joints were not evident. Edmund was the quintessential gentleman from South Carolina. Years of riding had made him tall, dark-haired, and broad-shouldered. He was a church deacon, a member of the town council. He talked with the measured cadence of old money, and he wore impeccable clothes. Because of his reputation as a fair master, he did not lash his slaves as frequently as his neighbors did during that era. But all would be destroyed by Edmund Hargrove's secret. Born Catherine Peaton, Catherine Hargrove wed Edmund in 1837. Her fortune rivaled that of the Hargroves, and she was from Charleston. Like other marriages, this one had been arranged as a union to fortify both families. With her dark hair styled flawlessly, her waist corseted to a stylish narrowness, and her pale skin shielded from the sun, she was gorgeous in the way that Southern society required. She received her education at the best academy in Charleston, schooled in painting, French, piano, and the art of running a home without seeming to accomplish anything. The season's biggest social event had been their wedding. 400 people were present at St. Michael's Church. They were hailed as the ideal couple by everyone. Everyone predicted that their kids would be gorgeous. However, after 6 years of marriage, no children were born. In parlors, this was whispered, always with the mix of sympathy and condemnation society reserves for women who didn't fulfill their primary role. Those murmurs weighed heavily on Catherine. Edmund's mother's carefully veiled disappointment was visible to her. She was aware that every year she lived was less valuable. Catherine was not entirely sure why there were no children, why Edmund rarely visited her bed, why he appeared aloof, his thoughts elsewhere even when there was his body. The quarters behind the main mansion were home to the Truth. Daniel, Samuel, and Marcus were the names of the Truth. Marcus was 24 years old, the son of the chief cook on the plantation, light-skinned and had traits that suggested a mixed heritage that no one publicly discussed. Since the age of 15, he had been employed in the main house, first as a footman and later as Edmund's personal valet. He was a clever man who moved through the home like a shadow and could sense wants before they were expressed. Samuel was a 26-year-old man who worked in the stables. He was darker than Marcus, had muscles from hard work, and hands that were just as good at handling horses and fixing leather. Slavery could not completely destroy his inner strength and quiet dignity. 3 years prior, Edmund had taken notice of him and started looking for excuses to go to the stables more regularly. Daniel, a 21-year-old house carpenter, was adept at the intricate woodworking needed on the plantation. He was little, almost frail, and had long fingers and the eye of an artist. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was carefully and softly. Being invisible meant he was going to live, as he had discovered early. Edmund had used extreme caution. He always met them late at night on the East Wing, where Catherine never went and never together. That area was purportedly being restored, abandoned, and closed off. Edmund had turned it into a haven, a room with a separate entrance from the gardens, a big bed, heavy drapes, a lock, and oil lamps that cast gentle, forgiving light. This arrangement persisted for 3 years. Edmund kept up his public image flawlessly. While Catherine slept in her own bedroom as was customary, Edmund went down the servants' stairs and crossed the darkened gardens to the East Wing, where one or more of the 3 men would be waiting. He also attended church every Sunday, conducted business with merciless efficiency, and smiled at his wife across dinner tables. There was nothing these men could do. They belonged to the property. They arrived when their lord called them. It didn't matter if they were feeling fear, desire, resignation, or complex combinations of all 3. Compliance was necessary for survival. Refusal resulted in family separation and a punishment sale. Thus they arrived, remained silent when called. They assured themselves that they had some modest advantages Edmund gave them in return for their bodies and their silence, such as slightly better food and clothing, and that they were at least protected from fieldwork that broke other men's bodies. But ultimately, secrets, no matter how meticulously kept, came to light. A secret this significant could only remain hidden for so long in a home where dozens of slaves roamed through the darkness, where spouses slept awake to the sound of creaking floorboards, and where hatred and jealousy boiled beneath every contact. At first, Catherine had only noticed little things. Edmund always locks the door to the East Wing. After weeks of remote moodiness, he seemed energetic on certain mornings, almost joyful. Marcus's eyes never quite meet hers as he moves through the home with a certain intensity. Samuel should be in the quarters, but he is always in the garden late at night. Daniel occasionally had marks on his neck that appeared to be from his lips or fingers. The alternative was unimaginable, so she had observed and dismissed these observations. It is impossible, unnatural, and against God, nature, and all the laws of civilized society for any Southern gentleman to do such things. Catherine wasn't a fool, though. She'd grown up in a society where women were taught to pay attention and decipher hints that men might have been concealing. After 6 years of being married to a guy who was getting farther away, enduring pity glances and hushed discussions, and feeling less valuable every year, she went without having children. Truth had gradually started to creep into her meticulously preserved denial, like water seeping through foundation cracks. Catherine came to a decision late on August 11, 1843. She would be aware of the reality. She would witness it with her own eyes, no matter how awful it was. Catherine waited until it was quiet and dark inside the house. She could hear Edmund walking down the servants' stairs and in the corridor. She let him 10 minutes, which was plenty time for him to get to the East Wing, settle in, and feel secure. Then she got out of bed, wrapped her white nightgown in a dark shawl, and went after him. Only a quarter moon and the dim glow from the slave quarters lit the garden. Catherine walked cautiously on stone walkways, her bare feet silent. Her heart was beating so rapidly that she believed it may wake the entire plantation, and she could hear distant river sounds and cicadas in trees. The East Wing was her destination. The side door was ajar just a little. Internal light flickered, creating shifting shadows. Catherine came slowly up, hands shaking, shallow breathing. She peered through the door's opening. The area was more spacious than anticipated and was thoughtfully equipped to demonstrate that this was not a transient setup. The bed took up most of the room, draped in luxurious linens that Catherine knew were absent from the stock of the home. The landscape was illuminated with soft light from oil lamps. Edmund lay naked on the bed with 3 other people entwined with him. Together, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel moved in a way that made it clear what was going on. Their actions, sounds, and clear familiarity all suggested a long-standing, comfortable connection. The scream that rose in Catherine's throat was suppressed as her hand shot to her mouth. She couldn't take her eyes off of what she was seeing, so she stood still. Her husband, a well-respected landowner, church deacon, and social pillar, was involved in actions that were not only against the law, but also regarded as the height of wickedness. What Catherine saw in South Carolina in 1843 was a crime that Edmund, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel might all be executed for. The law was merciless and made no distinction. The act was referred to as sodomy. Even yet, that word was hardly ever said out loud. It was seen as an abomination, a sin so horrible that it could corrupt good people just by being discussed. Even though it seemed like forever, Catherine stared for maybe 30 seconds. In their marriage, she had never seen Edmund kiss Marcus with such care. She saw the familiar movement of Samuel's hands across Edmund's back. Edmund laughed as she saw Daniel whisper something. Sincere laughter she hadn't heard in a long time years. Something cold and hard crystallized in Catherine's breast as she saw her husband display more genuine emotion and desire with 3 captive men than he had ever showed her. Though there was betrayal, it wasn't the only thing. She experienced more than just shame. She was filled with wrath, pure, determined, and focused rage. She had dedicated 6 years of her life to this man, put up with rumors and judgment, devalued herself, and made an effort to be the ideal wife. He had been in this room with these men the entire time, living his real life while she was living a fiction. With her mind already racing, Catherine retreated from the door. She went back inside, went upstairs to her room, and sat down at her desk to write. She breathed calmly and her hands were steady now. She took out paper and lit a candle. She started writing 3 letters, one to Edmund's mother, one to Edmund and Sheriff Charles Denore. She detailed what she had seen in each, omitting no details that were essential to capturing the whole horror. She went to Edmund's door, slipped his note under it, and sealed the 3 letters. She went back to her room and waited for morning while fully clothed and lying in bed. At morning, Edmund discovered the letter. He read it, cracked the seal, and picked it up. His face lost its color. Hands trembled. As though repetition may alter the words, he read 3 times. He had been spotted by Catherine. She was well informed. Additionally, she had previously sent letters to his mother and the sheriff. Edmund's initial reaction was fear. Run, get in a saddle and horse, head north, and vanish. Where would he go, though? He owned a plantation, and this land was vital to who he was. Other than overseeing slave work and upholding his social standing, he possessed no abilities. He was nothing without Willowbrook and the Harrove name. Denial was his second impulse. Maybe he might persuade Catherine that she misinterpreted. He was aware of the foolishness and desperation of these thoughts even as they were developing. Catherine had provided evidence that she had seen exactly what she claimed to have seen. Anger was his third impulse. How could she possibly endanger him? But that anger was short-lived, since Edmund was aware of the reality. His actions were inexcusable in the strict moral realm of antebellum South, since he had deceived her and lived a lie. He went to knock on Catherine's bedroom door. No response. He tested the handle, locked. He knocked more forcefully. "Catherine, we have to please discuss." Calm and icy, she spoke from behind the door. "Edmund, there's nothing to talk about. The letters are on their way. Within an hour, Sheriff Denore will show up. Soon after, your mother. Since there won't be any peace in this world, I advise you to spend what time you have left to make peace with God." Edmund slammed the door into his forehead. "I can explain, Catherine, please. Describe how you have defiled yourself and your slaves for 3 years. Describe how you have disparaged our name in marriage. Edmund, there's no explanation that counts. You're a sodomite. You are that. You are only that, and by dusk everyone will be aware of it." At 7:30, Sheriff Denore and 2 deputies showed up. Still wearing her nightgown, Catherine greeted them at the door. She offered coffee, welcomed them inside, and described the circumstances in the cool, collected manner of a woman reporting a property dispute. The 60-year-old sheriff was big, with gray beard and eyes that had witnessed all human evil. He had known Edmund since he was a young lad, and he had been a guest at the wedding. Christmas gatherings. His expression darkened with betrayal, disdain, and the icy resolve of a man who understood exactly what the law needed as he listened to Catherine recount what she had seen and read her in-depth account. "Mrs. Hargrove, these are severe charges, the worst a man may experience in this condition. I sent for you right away because I know, Sheriff. My hubby is studying. The apartments include the 3 slaves he was with. I want them all taken into custody. I want the law to be applied as strictly as possible in this situation." Slowly, the sheriff nodded. "Where did this incident take place?" "The wing on the east. A room there is set up specifically for this use. Everything will be just as I explained." Sheriff Denore gave his deputies a gesture. Catherine took the lead as they made their way through the home. She showed them the room itself, the side door, and the east wing. Lamps were still burning low and the bed was still unmade. There was indisputable proof of what had happened. The sheriff clenched his jaw. This was a breach of the entire social order as well as the law. Edmund Hart, renowned citizen, community leader, and one of the wealthiest persons in the county. And since the alternative was to allow such behavior to continue unchecked, which would rock their society to its core, he would now have to be publicly and totally eliminated. The sheriff instructed his deputies to arrest Mr. Hargrove, take him to the town jail, then proceed to the quarters and take Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, the 3 slaves, into custody. To the study the deputies went. Edmund took action, not fight. He put down his glass, rose up when they came in, and held out his wrists for shackles. He had no expression on his face. As they walked him by Catherine in the corridor, he gave her one glance. Without flinching, she looked him in the eye. Edmund remarked in a low voice, "I hope you understand what you have done. This will destroy you as much as it destroys me." Catherine grinned, a dreadful, frigid smile. "I will live through this, Edmund. I will go back to Charleston and be with my family. I will be the wronged wife, the innocent victim of your wickedness. But you will be nothing, just a name people whisper about, a warning. I know exactly what I have done. I have exposed you for what you are." Edmund remained silent as deputies escorted him outside to a waiting wagon. In a matter of minutes, he was shackled like a common criminal, his fall from grace so abrupt and total that it seemed almost unreal, and Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken from their quarters in chains. The news spread like wildfire, whispered in shops and parlors, discussed in horrified tones over dinners, debated in Beaufort, and by evening, everyone knew that the 4 men were locked in separate cells. In 1843, South Carolina, slaves had no legal defense against such charges, and their families watched in silent horror, knowing that their loved ones were caught in something that would likely end in death. The taverns. Edmund Hargrove, the dignified planter, had been caught in the act of having 3 male slaves with another woman. His wife had found him and reported him to the police. The scandal was so big that it overshadowed all other subjects. The week between Edmund's arrest and his trial seemed to drag on forever, as though Buffett was holding its breath. Judge Howard Middleton, 68, a veteran of the War of 1812, known for his strict interpretation of the law, presided over the legal proceedings in Beaufort County. They had witnessed theft, adultery, drunkenness, violence, and all the other common sins pass through the courthouse. But this was different. It touched something deeper and more terrifying. The violation was so serious that it threatened the very order of their world. The law was clear. Sodomy was defined as the abominable crime by South Carolina statutes, and he had known Edmund since childhood, signed the marriage license, approved loans for Willowbrook expansion, and sat in chambers for more than an hour, reading and rereading charges after receiving documents related to Edmund's arrest. Now he was being asked to preside over Edmund's destruction. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The act itself, if proven, demanded the harshest consequences, but Judge Middleton faced complications. Edmund was white, wealthy, and from the founding family. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were enslaved, property, and legally worth perhaps $800 each. Against nature, the statute prescribed punishment of either death or a lesser penalty as the court deemed appropriate, though death was strongly implied in the statute. The question was how to deal with Edmund without setting a precedent that might threaten other wealthy white men, with secrets they would prefer to keep hidden. The law applied equally in theory, but in reality everyone knew that enslaved people would be punished more severely and quickly. On August 15th, Judge Middleton called a private meeting which was attended by Sheriff Dunor, County Prosecutor Richard Fellows, 3 prominent citizens, including the mayor and 2 church deacons. Neither Catherine nor anyone representing Edmund were invited. The judge began by saying, "Gentlemen, we are in a situation that calls for both justice and discretion. The charges against Mr. Hargrove are backed by indisputable evidence. His wife saw the crime firsthand, and physical evidence supports the testimony. If this were any other man, any man of lower status, we would go straight to conviction and sentencing. It's Edmund Hargrove, though. His family has been in this community for 3 generations, and his plantation employs hundreds of people directly or indirectly. If we put him to death, what will happen to his slaves? What about his property, his debts, and the debts he owes?" Mayor Thomas Pritchard interrupted. Sheriff Dunor continued, "With respect, Mayor, we cannot allow wealth or status considerations to interfere with justice. If we treat Mr. Harrove differently than we would treat a poor farmer or shopkeeper, we undermine entire foundation of law. Prosecute a Fellows thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles that shook his head firmly. Fellows is correct. Dude, in my prison, 3 slaves took part. What message does it convey that the wealthy can do as they like if we allow anyone to evade justice? Only common people are subject to that law. Speak gravely with moral certainty, said Reverend Samuel Cartwright. Gentlemen, this is not just a legal issue. It's a spiritual crisis. Mr. Harrove's actions are a disgrace to God. It undermines the moral basis of our society and taints the natural order. By extending mercy and reducing the severity of punishment, we imply that such behavior is somehow acceptable. We are unable to accomplish that. We can't. Judge Middleton gave a slow nod. Then allow me to suggest a plan of action. We'll have a trial. Conviction is certain based on the facts presented, but I will exercise discretion when determining the appropriate sentence. Mr. Hargrove won't be put to death. Objections erupted in the room. Multiple males talking simultaneously. The judge held out a hand for quiet. Listen to me. Death would be a form of mercy for a man in his circumstances. Private burial, closed coffin, speedy finish. His family was able to grieve and go forward. No. What it's worse than death, I suggest. Edmund Harrove will be so severely punished in public that he will wish we had hanged him. Destroy not only his body but also his personality, reputation, and spirit. To ensure that everyone in the community knows exactly what happens to guys who commit this crime, have them all watch. What kind of punishment would this be? The prosecutor inquired. The look on Judge Middleton's face was icy. Calculating the pillory and whipping post in the town square took 3 entire days, not just an hour or 2. From sunrise to sunset, confined to pillory, they were subjected to the weather, insects, mockery, and the curses of onlookers. Additionally, he is publicly whipped at noon every day, not enough to kill him but enough to leave permanent scars. Enough to cover the remainder of his life. His physique bears the scars of humiliation. The room became quiet. The brutality of the idea appeared to surprise even the individuals who were most adamant about severe punishment. They will be hanged, Judge stated without hesitation in response to Reverend Cartwright's hushed question about the slaves. They are property who corrupted their master. They seduced him into depravity. They will serve as example of what happens when slaves step beyond their place. Executions will precede Mr. Hargrove's punishment by 1 day. In order to understand the consequences of his conduct, Denore the sheriff scowled. Your Honor is not simply that. According to all accounts, Hargrove was the one who started these connections. Slaves were powerless, couldn't turn down their master. Not all the time necessity and justice go hand in hand. According to sheriff law, everyone involved in sodomy must face consequences. The restoration of natural order is more crucial for white citizens. If white males fall, it's from a great height. Slaves who engage in such behavior must be completely eradicated. It is the only way to keep control, but it is brutal. Men looked at each other. Reluctantly and slowly, they nodded in accord. Although no one was entirely satisfied, the solution struck a balance between the conflicting demands of the law, social hierarchy, and the desire to set an example that would be felt much beyond Beaufort. However, Catherine Harrove had not been taken into consideration by Judge Middleton. She had sources, but she wasn't there. Young Benjamin Porter, one of the judge's clerks, was pursuing Catherine's cousin when he overheard a conversation and relayed it to his fiancée, who promptly informed Catherine. Catherine wasn't happy with the strategy when she found out. She had not thought that Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel would be put to death, but she had wanted Edmund destroyed. Even though she was furious, she saw that these 3 men had been stuck in an impossible circumstance. They belonged to the property, had no option but to follow the instructions of the master. Even by the perverted standards of slave culture, it seemed unfair to execute them for Edmund's wickedness. But Catherine knew something more too. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel saw Edmund's humiliation, were hung and buried in front of the town, or died before Edmund's public punishment. Then Edmund would end up as a kind of martyr. There was something sad and romantic about his fall, and people would mutter that he had loved his slaves and given his life for them. Catherine could not permit that story to be told. She requested a private conference with Judge Middleton. Curious about what a woman at Scandal Center might possibly desire, he consented. 2 days prior to the trial, they met in his chambers. Catherine showed up, dressed, No one had died, but it was completely dark in the morning. Deliberate decision, a graphic depiction of death, her marriage, her aspirations, and her future. With her hands folded and a composed demeanor, she sat perfectly opposite the judge. "I am aware of the punishment you have in mind for my husband and the 3 slaves who helped him commit the crime, Your Honor." The judge's eyebrows went up. "Mrs., that was a private conversation." Hargrove: "Your Honor, how did you find out about it in a community this size? Not anything stays secret for very long. However, I'm not here to challenge your judgment or authority. I'm here to ask for something, then talk. I ask that all 4 men be punished. Happen at the same time. That instead of being hanged separately, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were present as Edmund was beaten and pillaged for 3 days. That Edmund must witness their executions on the last day after his punishment is finished, and that they must witness what happens to the guy who used them." Judge studied her, leaning back. "Even for a wounded woman, Mrs. Hargrove, that is incredibly harsh." "Your Honor, I had no mercy for my husband, showed no regard for our marriage, showed no respect for God's commandments. Why should I suddenly be kind to him? Why should he be allowed the dignity of punishment at a place where he might see himself as a victim? Let him witness the results of his goals. Knowing that his actions led those 3 men to the gallows, let him watch them perish. Allow the entire village to witness his wickedness and its effects." After a prolonged period of silence, Judge Middleton gently nodded. "Your request has been fulfilled. I'll adjust the sentence appropriately. The trial will start in 3 days. After the verdict, punishment will start the next day." "It will be just how you said." Catherine straightened her black skirts, stepped up, and gave the judge a chilly little smile. "Your Honor, thank you. There should be full justice. The full story ought to be told. There should be no secrets." August 18, 1843 was the start of the trial. The courtroom is overcrowded. In an attempt to hear every word, people squeezed themselves against windows, stood in aisles, and packed doors. This was more than a trial. It was a decade-long social event, a spectacle that would be the subject of years of discussion and controversy. They brought Edmund in shackles. Since his detention, he has been prohibited from changing clothing. Once a nice shirt was wrinkled and discolored, the eyes were empty, and the face was haggard. He appeared to be a man who had going through the motions of life because he had no other option, having already dead inside. Separately, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken in chains and forced to stand in a corner of the courtroom while being watched over by armed deputies. They displayed a range of emotions on their faces. Marcus appeared calm and resigned, as though he had come to terms with the situation. Samuel's eyes were blazing with silent anger and his jaw was fixed. Daniel was shaking and shedding quiet sobs. Middleton, the judge, sat down. The prosecutor stood up and brought charges. Catherine was then asked to give her testimony. With her head held high, she headed to the witness stand. Now I was dressed in dark gray, which was still dawn hues but a little softer. Put a hand on the Bible and vowed to speak the truth. Then explained in precise detail what she had seen on the morning of August 12th, in a clear, calm voice. There was complete silence in the courtroom while she talked. The men shifted uneasily. It is impossible to determine whether women fanned themselves due to shock or heat. Edmund's reputation, dignity, and humanity were all destroyed by Catherine's words, which were like hammer blows. After she was done, the prosecutor said, "Mrs. Hargrove, do you think you might have misinterpreted what you saw?" The defense attorney, young William Crawford, who was assigned to Edmund's case and was obviously wishing he hadn't been, stood for cross-examination. "No, sir, there is no chance of misunderstanding. What I saw was obvious, unmistakable, and intentional. My husband was involved in an act of sodomy with 3 male slaves. He wasn't coerced or confused. He was willingly and enthusiastically participating in acts that violate every law of God and man." Catherine narrowed her eyes and said, "Hargrove, is it possible that your husband's behavior was the result of temporary insanity? That he was not in right mind?" "My husband has been going through this for at least 3 years, Mr. Crawford. That is not temporary insanity. That is deliberate choice. That is who he is." Crawford tried a few more questions, but each one only made things worse for Edmund. At last he sat down defeated with no way to defend himself, the evidence overwhelming, the witness unflinching. When asked if he wanted to testify, Edmund shook his head, but what could he say? The truth was indisputable. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were not permitted to testify. Slaves were not permitted to testify in court unless there were specific circumstances, and this was not one of them. Their guilt was presumed based on Catherine's testimony and tangible evidence. They were left without a voice, no opportunity to defend themselves, and were left to wait in a corner for the inevitable verdict. Judge Middleton said to the jury, "Gentlemen of jury, you have heard testimony, you have seen evidence. The law is clear on this matter. Sodomy is a crime of the highest order, an abomination that threatens the moral fabric of our society. You must now determine whether accused are guilty of this crime." The jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes, but everyone knew their verdict was predetermined. "We find defendant Edmund Harrove guilty of sodomy." A murmur swept through the courtroom as they returned, with some voices expressing satisfaction and others sounding shocked despite the certainty of the outcome. "We find slaves Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel guilty of sodomy and of corrupting their master." This verdict was delivered more subtly, almost as an afterthought. The jury only made it official. Judge Middleton nodded. "Court accepts verdict. We will proceed to sentencing." He waited, allowing tension to develop. The destiny of the three men had never been in doubt. They were already dead in the eyes of the law. "Edmund Harrove, you have been found guilty of the abominable crime of sodomy. The law allows me to sentence you to death, and many people think that would be a suitable punishment. But I think death would be too merciful. You have broken not only the law but also the sacred trust of your position, corrupted your slaves, abused authority, and brought shame upon your family and community." Everyone leaned forward to hear the punishment that would be imposed. Edmund shut his eyes, waiting for the sentence to proceed. "For that reason, I give you a 3-day public punishment, which includes being imprisoned in the town square from dawn to dusk every day, receiving 20 whippings at noon every day, being permanently marked so that you will always bear the scars of your crime, and seeing 3 slaves whose lives you destroyed with your irrational desires put to death." Despite the seriousness of the crime, many people thought that forcing Edmund to witness executions was excessive psychological torture. As for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, the judge went on, turning to face 3 enslaved men, "You are sentenced to death by hanging. Execution will take place." 3 days of pillory was cruel enough, but 60 lashes in total would leave the man scarred and broken. Positioned in the town square on the afternoon of the 3rd day of Edmund Hargrove's punishment, so he could see the results of the corruption he brought upon you, Daniel fell, but deputies caught him before he hit the ground and kept him standing. Samuel's face remained neutral, but his hands clenched into fists. Marcus looked at Edmund directly for the first time since the trial started, and his face showed something worse than fear or anger. As people filed out, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Some were relieved that justice had been served, while others were troubled by the severity. Many were already planning to attend a public spectacle drawn by morbid curiosity. Judge Middleton struck gavel. "This court is adjourned. Sentence will be carried out beginning tomorrow at dawn. May God have mercy on all your souls." With curiosity and knowledge, they were going to see something that had never happened in Beaufort before. Catherine left without glancing at Edmund, having accomplished her goal. Truth was made public, Edmund was destroyed, and she would soon be free to leave this place and never come back. Morning arrived too soon. While children were kept at home, adults and teenagers crowded the town square until there was hardly any space left. In the middle of the square stood a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, a whipping post, and a thick wooden pole with iron rings for securing condemned. Both had been freshly painted, as if someone wanted them to look their best for this occasion. The sun rose over Beaufort, casting golden light across the town square, and people were already assembling, with chairs set up for prominent citizens and others standing in groups conversing softly. Historic event. Edmund was taken from jail at dawn wearing only pants, his torso bare, his feet bare, and his hands bound behind his back. Deputies led him to the pillory and locked him there, his head and hands secured, his body hunched forward, and he was rendered completely immobile. The morning sun was already hot, and within an hour Edmund was perspiring, and 2 hours later flies had discovered him. He was in the middle of the morning when Catherine arrived with 2 female relatives from Charleston who had come to support her. She stood a distance away from pillory, not close enough to speak to Edmund, but close enough that he could see her if he raised his eyes. Within 3 hours his back was burning from the sun, and his legs were shaking from the strain of standing in one position. Some people laughed and called insults, while others just stared in silence. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel had been taken from jail and made to stand at the edge of the square, chained together under the watchful eyes of deputies. and they watched Edmund's punishment with differing reactions. Marcus maintained a neutral expression, showing nothing while Samuel watched, making sure his humiliation was complete. At noon, the real punishment started when Sheriff Denore approached Pillory with a long leather whip. The crowd fell silent, all eyes focused on the scene that was about to unfold, and Edmund Hargrove, the sheriff, made an announcement loud enough for everyone to hear. Daniel could not watch it all, keeping his eyes on the ground because he could not bear to see the man who had used him in pain. Edmund's body tensed. He had been whipped once as a child, a few strokes for mischievous behavior as a child, but that had been nothing compared to what was about to happen. He tried to prepare himself, but there was no preparation for this. You have been sentenced to 20 lashes. May this punishment serve as a reminder of the consequences of your crime, and as a warning to any other man who might be tempted to follow your path. Edmund gasped but did not cry out as a leather strip sliced across his naked back, with a boom that reverberated throughout the square. A thin line of scarlet emerged on his skin, and a second lash swiftly came, followed by a third. By the 5th lash, Edmund was moaning with every hit, and by the 10th he was screaming, unable to. When the 20th lash finally came, Edmund sagged in the pillory, held upright only by the wooden frame imprisoning him. The crowd was silent now, the excitement of seeing punishment replaced by the uncomfortable reality of watching a human being broken. By the 15th he was crying, his body trembling with each impact, the skin on his back torn in multiple places, and blood soaking into the waistband of his trousers. Sheriff Denore coiled the whip and stepped back. Edmund would stay in pillory until sunset. He would still be exposed and in pain, but at least he would not be whipped today. He would drift in and out of consciousness as the afternoon dragged on forever, with people coming and going, some staying hours, and others simply stopping by to witness the spectacle. Eventually, as the sun rose over horizon, the sheriff came back, unlocked pillory, and Edmund fell to the ground instantly, unable to stand. His back was a mass of scabbed lacerations from previous days' whipping, and every movement pulled at wounds, sending fresh waves of pain through body. Deputies caught him and dragged him back to jail, where a doctor had been ordered to examine him and make sure he would survive to endure the next 2 days. The second day started exactly like the first, with Edmund being brought out at dawn, locked in pillory, exposed to the sun, insects, and crowd jeers. Catherine returned as she had the day before, standing in her black at noon. Whipping resumed, with 20 more lashes applied to Edmund's already injured back, and he screamed at the first blow. People had started chatting about her, calling her cruel and vindictive, but they also understood her anger because she had been wronged in a way that few women could comprehend. Edmund's back looked like raw meat after the 20 lashes that Elle had ordered were applied. The doctor would later remark that he had never seen a man so severely whipped survive, but Edmund did, even though there were times when he wished he had not. He screamed, pleaded, and begged for mercy, but none came. The third day finally arrived. When Edmund was taken to pillory for the last time, his body was almost recognizable. His legs could hardly bear his weight. His face was swollen from sun exposure and insect bites, and his back was covered in blood-soaked bandages, but his sentence was obvious. 3 days in pillory and 3 whipping sessions would be fulfilled. The largest crowd yet was present on that day, and word had spread throughout the county. People had come from nearby towns to watch Edmund Hargrove's punishment and execution of 3 slaves. And the square was so crowded that deputies had to set up a perimeter to prevent the crowd from getting too close to the pillar and the gallows, which were made of a simple but sturdy wooden platform with 3 nooses hanging from a crossbeam. The final 20 lashes came at noon, and Edmund hardly reacted this time. He was beyond pleading, beyond screaming, and he just endured, body jerking with each impact, blood flowing freely from reopened wounds. They had been placed so Edmund, locked in pillory, would have a clear view of executions. This was Catherine's last gift to her husband, knowing that his desires had directly caused these men's deaths and his duty to watch as they died. He was more dead than alive when the whipping stopped, but he was conscious, which was crucial, because the doctor had been told to keep him conscious at all costs so he could see what happened next. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken from the jail at 2 boughs in the afternoon, and they passed through the crowd with their chains clanking with every step. Minister Reverend Cartwright stood on the platform waiting, holding a Bible, and he tried to offer final prayers, but Daniel interrupted him, saying, "Save your prayers, Reverend. Daniel's voice was surprisingly strong despite his fear, and he said, "We do not need prayers from God who allowed this to happen." Reverend flinched as though stung. "You blaspheme in your final moments? If there is a God who sees what is happening here today and does nothing to stop it, then that God is no God at all." Daniel responded, "I speak truth in my final moments, something that no one else in this town seems to be able to accomplish." Samuel then stated, glancing out at the throng, "You call us criminals. You label us corruptors, but we had no choice but to come when our master summoned us. Slaves do whatever it takes to survive. And now you murder us to preserve your own sense of order. Keep that in mind. Keep in mind what you did here today." The executioner, a man named John Kelly, who was the county's designated hangman, put noose around each man's neck, carefully adjusted them to ensure they would work as intended, then stepped back and waited. Marcus said nothing, just looked at Edmund, who was still locked in pillory 20 feet away. Their eyes met for a brief moment and something passed between them. Some final acknowledgement of the strange and terrible relationship they had shared. Judge Middleton, who was standing at the base of the gallows, gave a signal. He checked his pocket watch and nodded at precisely 2:15. The executioner then pulled a lever, causing the trapdoors beneath Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel to open simultaneously. 3 men fell, ropes twisted, and necks snapped with loud cracks that reverberated throughout Silent Square. Edmund watched as 3 men who had been property in life and remained property in death. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. They died swiftly, at least. That was the only mercy they received. Bodies swayed gently in the afternoon air. He let out a low wailing cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his broken soul. A sound of anguish, despair, and guilt that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. As was customary, bodies were left hanging for an hour to ensure death was complete, and serve as final warning before being cut down and loaded into a wagon and buried in an unmarked graveyard. Graves on the outskirts of town in a section designated for criminals and slaves who died without a family to claim them. Edmund was eventually freed from prison at sunset, but he collapsed right away and had to be taken back to jail. A doctor tested him and said he would live, but his recovery would be drawn out and painful. That evening, Judge Middleton visited Edmund's cell and saw a broken man lying barely conscious. "You have served your time, Mr. Harrove, and you are free to leave, but realize that you are no longer welcome in Beaufort or anywhere else in South Carolina. If you stay here and try to reclaim your property or position, you will discover that society has permanently closed its doors. You are conscious, covered in bandages, and your spirit is as damaged as your body." Edmund remained silent, but he gave this advice. "Go west, go north, go anywhere but here, and pray that no one where you land ever finds out your name or history." Nothing could be said. It was the end of his life as he had knew it. He had lost everything he had worked for and everything he had been. He was now a living reminder of what happened to males who disobeyed the unspoken social norms in the South. 3 days later, following Edmund left Beaufort once he had recovered sufficiently to be able to stand on clothing and a tiny sum of money that the court had permitted him to keep from the sale of his belongings, were taken by him. To settle debts, the Willowbrook Plantation was put up for auction. Slaves, including Rachel, Marcus's wife, were sold to different buyers across the area. A Charleston family bought the house, changed the name, and attempted to remove any association with the Harrove name. Edmund vanished into America's immensity. According to some, he visited Texas. Others asserted that he passed away within a year because he was unable to live without the luxury and security he had always enjoyed. Few rumors circulated that he visited California during the gold rush. Among the multitudes of men fleeing their pasts, he lost himself. However, no one was positive. Edmund Hargrove just vanished as completely as though he had been put to death. With Daniel, Samuel, and Marcus, as anticipated, Catherine went back to Charleston. Resuming her maiden name, Peon, she informed everyone of her husband's passing. This was true in a sense. The man she had wed had vanished. Her family embraced her return, knowing her plight and that she had been the innocent victim of heinous deceit. She never got married again. She managed her inheritance, went to church, and kept up the air of a decent widow while leading a peaceful life. However, according to many who knew her, there was a harsh, icy alteration in her eyes that had not previously existed. She may have damaged something within herself in the process of destroying her marriage. Years went by. Although the Willowbrook Plantation scandal was soon forgotten, young men continued to hear it as a warning about the dangers of unnatural sin. Judge Middleton's order to safeguard the reputations of the families concerned meant that county documents remained sealed. However, an unforeseen event occurred in 1897, 54 years after the events. A young historian named Thomas Bradford requested access to locked county documents in order to conduct research for his PhD thesis in antebellum South Carolina. The judge gave permission after much discussion, stating that history deserved the truth, that enough time had passed, and that all those directly engaged were long deceased. Bradford studied trial transcripts, Catherine's testimony, correspondence from the judge to other officials, eyewitness descriptions of punishment and executions, medical reports on Edmund's condition, and plantation sale finance data over the course of 3 months. Everything has been kept in perfect condition. In addition to the events themselves, which were unsettling enough, Bradford was astounded by what he learned about antebellum society. Strict moral standards upheld by spectacular acts of public violence, laws that did not distinguish between willing participants and enslaved individuals who had no other option, and communities' willingness to watch suffering and take part in the destruction of one of their own when he disobeyed social order. In 1899, he published his research in a scholarly magazine with a small readership. Although the article generated some debate among historians, the general public mostly ignored it. The story was too ancient, too unsettling, and too inconsistent with the romanticized notions of the Old South that were popular at the time. 8 decades after the incident, Beaufort County eventually made all of the sealed documents available to the public in 1923. The local newspaper published, "An intriguing historical oddity is presented in this brief piece regarding the Harg Grove case." According to the article, Catherine Peaton lived until the age of 192, before passing away in Charleston at the age of 87. Although the descendants of Marcus Samuel and Daniel's families still resided in the area, the majority of them were unaware of the exact circumstances behind their relatives' deaths, and Edmund Harravis' final fate was unknown. The article ended with a comment that seemed to misunderstand the whole meaning. The criteria were different at the time, of justice and morality. Being in a more enlightened era is something for which we can only be thankful. Was it truly that different, though? Few people who genuinely grasped the story were troubled by the question. The laws had evolved indeed. Executions in public were outlawed. Torture was no longer an acceptable form of discipline. However, human cruelty in the name of upholding social order, the use of the law to crush those who challenged established hierarchies, the creation of scapegoats, and the need for blood sacrifices to quell public anger and fear. Had anything really changed? In 2015, a tiny historical organization in Beaufort placed a memorial close to the location of the 1843 gallows. Marker stated that 3 enslaved males, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, last names unknown, had been executed on this place for crimes that modern understanding recognized they could not have refused to commit. It was called by Marker injustice, referred to it as a tragedy, and cited it as a reminder of social structures and legal frameworks that prioritized property rights over human dignity. Marker didn't mention Edmund Hardrove Catherine, the 3 days in pillory, or the 60 lashes that left scars that would last a lifetime. That portion of the narrative was still too awkward, complicated, and unresponsive to straightforward moral teachings about historical injustices. Being both a victim and a perpetrator, Edmund had abused his position of authority to force enslaved men into sexual relationships against their will. However, society had also devastated him, denying him the ability to be himself and driving him to conceal, lie, and establish a secret room where he could be himself for a few stolen hours. Catherine was both victim and perpetrator. She had endured years of humiliation and condemnation, been imprisoned in a loveless marriage, and been truly harmed. However, she had also planned an exceptionally harsh punishment, guaranteeing Edmund's psychological and spiritual devastation, in addition to his physical devastation. The story's purest victims were Daniel, Samuel, and Marcus, men with no voice, no authority, and no options who were manipulated and later put to death to uphold social order they had nothing to do with establishing. Hundreds of people who believed they were defending justice and morality watched their killings, which were legal murder approved by the courts. Over the course of 3 August days in 1843, 347 individuals assembled in Beaufort Town Square, who came their families to witness 3 guys being hanged and a man being tortured. They termed it righteousness while mocking and hurling objects. What were they? Were they monsters? Or were they regular people who had been indoctrinated that preserving social order required spectacular brutality, that certain lives were worth less than others, that public suffering served higher purpose? There are no simple answers to these problems. History hardly ever does. The events in Beaufort Town Square and Willowbrook Plantation were not isolated incidents. It was logical extension of laws and social systems that existed throughout antebellum South, throughout America, throughout human societies that construct themselves on hierarchies of power and enforce those hierarchies through aggression. The story is nevertheless unsettling, not because it is so dissimilar from our own, but rather because it exposes unsettling realities about human nature, such as how easily compassion vanishes when we are led to believe that violence is necessary for justice, on how readily we persuade ourselves that killing other people safeguards our own goodness and safety. Judge Middleton, Sheriff Denore, Reverend Cartwright, Edmund Harrove, Catherine Peaton, Marcus Samuel Daniel, and 347 witnesses have all passed away. Their world is gone. However, there are still traces of their actions, decisions, and acts of violence that they either committed, saw, or experienced. You can still hear them if you pay close attention. How do you feel about this tale? Do you feel everything was revealed, or are there still secrets hidden in Beaufort's past? Post a comment below if this somber story from American history appealed to you, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear if you'd like to read more tales like this one. Press the alert button and tell someone who is fascinated by historical secrets. See you in the upcoming video as we reveal another buried horror from America's history.